I'm Wallace Warfield. I'll be moderating this panel. And the title is The Roots and Future Prospects of Militant Islam in Somalia. So for those of you who've been even reading the newspapers casually, you're aware of the fact that there's a tremendous struggle going on in Somalia, as it is in Pakistan and Afghanistan, over the role that Sharia will play in governing and shaping the contours of life and society in those states. We're focusing on Somalia this evening. I'm joined by an august panel. We have with us Mahdi Abdi on my far left, who is chairman of the East Africa Policy Institute, an institution designed to explore its solutions to regional policy issues with an emphasis on Somalia, Somaliland, by providing news and analysis of recent topics in order to connect, educate, and collaborate with individuals and entities interested in finding sound solutions for regional problems. The Institute also serves as a focal point that provides an environment conducive to vigorous debate, research, and analysis that is geared towards the development of practical policy initiatives for governments and global institutions. And to his right, my good friend and colleague, Dr. Terrance Lyons. Terrance's research has focused on the relationships between protracted civil wars and processes of political development and sustainable peace, with a particular focus on Africa and on policy issues. And to his right, we have another colleague. In our program, students are colleagues as well. Hussein Yusuf, who is, he says to keep it short, he's a PhD student in our program. Yay! But he's also the program officer for the Engaging Governments and Genocide Prevention program, which is a program that's headed up by Dr. Andrea Bartoli here at ICAR. And to his right, and to my immediate left, is Dr. Jamie Price, who is presently a research professor in the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, and executive director of the Sergeant Shriver Peace Institute, and as director of the Shriver Center at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He developed the Shriver Peace Worker Program, a 2-year graduate leadership program for returning Peace Corps volunteers that integrates graduate study, community service, and ethical reflection. What we're going to be looking at tonight is a couple of things. One of them that occurs to me is how do we imagine religion as a normative force of transformation to conflict-ridden states? What role does religion play in that respect? And how do we envision the role of the United States government in these developments? Should the United States government be a leader? Should it be collaborative? Should it be a follower? What is the appropriate role for the U.S. government in these issues? Have we established a speaking order? Dr. Mahdi, what would you do first?
Thank you. Well, I'm honored to be part of this very distinguished panel. I thank Hussein for giving me the news that I need to give here today. And one of the things that I tell him was that as a Somali, one thing is for sure, I have plenty of opinions. But solutions are not too easily forthcoming, when it comes to Somalia, and that's not an easy place to find a solution for all of us, if not already found. One of the difficulties that we have in Somalia, as vis-a-vis the rest of the world, is that we only, at least in the West, we tend to view things as they're happening, and we don't go beyond just the daily news cycle, whether it's the Al-Shabaab movement, or whether it's the pirates doing their things, whether it was the warlords and their activities in the past, or whether it's the Ethiopian invasion or the next famine. It's always the current thing that draws all the attention, as opposed to understanding that each of these things are interconnected and there's a root cause. All of these things that we see now are basically symptoms of a larger problem that exists. And unless those are being addressed, there's a very little chance Somalia or that situation getting any better anytime soon. And I have been a long-time student of the event in Somalia, not by choice, but by birth, I guess. I'm from there. I was born there. Now I'm an American citizen, but your formative years are something that stay with you, and that Somalia has a strong hold on all of its children, and I'm not different. I have a little piece I wrote a while ago that I'd like to share with you, and it basically addresses a little bit of a background of the history of Somalia as it became a nation and what got us to the point we are today. And in order to understand what is Somalia, one must look beyond the obvious and the daily occurrence of the tragedies and comedies of a bloated government today, attempting to ward off what seems to be an irreversible wind beneath the tips of a latest mad mullahs. Islamic movement, which is a political movement, it has very little to do with Islam. And that's the difficulties that people in the West have difficulty separating the two. It's a tool today, and most Somalis understand it as such, that this so-called Islamic movement is a tool. It's a movement designed to gain power. And one of the reasons why they are the way they are is because they like the ability to think strategically as well as tactically. And ultimately, you know, when they were faced with the onslaught of the Ethiopian invasion, they faded away into nothing and simply did not put up any kind of resistance. So there was no loyalty or faith involved in running when it came time to. They had no problem putting some kids in front of these tanks, but when the reality came, all the leadership pretty much picked up and left. So for the average Somali with a vision where being a member of an inclusive democratic Somalia free from foreign influence is more important than being a member of a clan, more effort is required to bring about the kind of change. It's not enough to wish for things one would like to see in life. One must actively take the necessary steps and turn those wishes into achievable goals. But deep down, we all know that the elusive, idealistic Somalia is right now unattainable, because the idea of Somalia, where everyone is a stakeholder, has been in decline for a very long time, as its inception. It died a little when Somaliland chose the union of independence and was promptly delegated to a second-class status. For those of you who are not familiar with the history, Somalia was unfortunate enough to have been colonized by every other European country. We had the French took one part, the Italians took another part, and then you had the British Somaliland, which was a protector. And in 1960, in June 26, 1960, the British ceded nationhood to Somaliland. And instead of, and they actually encouraged Somaliland to become declare its independence and become a nation of its own. But the need to be part of a larger Somalia and to be part of this family of Somali nation was much too strong for them to do anything else but wait for 4 days until they joined the southern Somali part, which was colonized by the Italians, which became independent in 1960. And in 1960 there was a union between the north and the south, and we had the Somali Republic that came about. And the difficulty started then because when the northern delegation that came from the north came to the south, they were expecting peace, reciprocity, something in return. And that did not take place because the southern politicians ended up taking the premium positions of the presidency and the prime ministership. And that was what some call the original sin of Somalia, because that stayed with, that insult pretty much stayed with the Somalis in the north, where it became the seed that created the need to become independent at a very age. It's worth noting that President Abdi, who was the first president of Somalia, managed to beat his opponent, Sheikh, by a single vote. Parliament elected the president of the Somali constitution at the time. And for all practical purposes, he was tied to pick someone from his own party, and that's how he ended up picking Sheikh, which by the way, is the father of the current prime minister. So as things change, things remain the same, you know, as in Somalia. Subsequent elected parliaments and different prime ministers chipped at the moral fiber of the nation and made corruption and nepotism an ordinary affair. Elections were largely a tribal affair, sometimes violent, and far from being fair. The condition reignited the natural tendency, the tribal tendencies, that were momentarily suppressed by the need to expel the former colonial powers, and shifted the mood from a nation of brotherly love to one of singular clan and personal ambition. The bright light of the five-pointed star was not shining for everyone, and Mandek, the Somali symbol for the motherland, was showing severe signs of neglect by the time Siad Barre came to the scene, and with scientific socialism delivered the fatal blow to Mandek and any notion that might have had about realizing the dream of being one among equals. In his world, and as a dictator, there was a coup that took place in 1969. The military took over after the assassination of Abdi, who was the first prime minister of the country at the time. Of his assassination, he was the president. One of the distinct historical aspects that very few people know about is that Somalia is one of the few African nations, now you have South Africa, that actually had an election where the president lost and ceded the office to the next president peacefully without having anything, any need to stay. In Africa, we usually are dragged out of their seats. But when Barre came, it was not enough to be in power. It was essential for him to remain in power by any means necessary. And to that end, he found friends in the Soviet Union first, and in the United States. And Somalis of every stripe, the superpowers, found the simplicity of dealing with one man to control a whole country, an offer they could not resist, and were willing partners in aiding the regime to maintain control irrespective of the methods employed. For them, it was a simple case of the end justifying the means. This brutal lesson he taught for 22 years was that being in power was no longer an ambition, but a necessity if anyone was to survive the regime. The one lasting legacy he left us was to shape future office seekers in his own image and adopt this notion that opposing the regime meant opposing the nation. And the consequences of that were very clear to all. In essence, he was Mandek, he was the nation. And she was no longer a benevolent, life-sustaining camel. She morphed into a life-taking beast that demanded and found sacrificial lambs on a regular basis. The reason why Somalia cannot find a stable government today is because we can all see the beast in all the current players, and Mandek is nowhere to be found. Mandek is an image, it's a symbol for Somalis. It's a camel. It's a female camel. It's the one that actually gives the milk to and sustains life for the nomad. So the highest form of praise goes to the camels because they are a nomadic society and without it they cannot survive. For all practical purposes, it's the American eagle. She's not here because we have abandoned her, and I'm speaking about Somalis here, and we chose a different path, a path that led us to the tribal path, and it's not one that it's the one that brought us here. And as we watched today, the U.S. first attempting to stand the TFG, that was the transitional federal government, on Ethiopian stilts, and now with 500 strong parliament, with their own moderate Islamist president. Sheikh Sharif, who's the current president today, was part of the original folks who precipitated the Ethiopian invasion, supported by America, and actually some did say designed by America. Whether this will work remains to be seen. But the telling story is that an observation made by Professor Ken Manhouse, he's from Davidson College, in an event in Washington, D.C., where the way forward for Somalia was explored a couple of years back. And here he suggested that if this latest attempt to establish a government does not work in Somalia, everyone's plan B is to allow the age of the warlords to come back in Mogadishu because they are a known commodity and they can be easily dealt with. In other words, the U.S. and Ethiopia can fade back into the horizon and bring back their hammer anytime the situation requires. The moral of the story is that God helps those who help themselves, and even those who wish to win the Lord must act and get up and buy the damn thing. building a country that fulfills the aspiration, dreams, and restores the honor of lost people requires hard work. The kind of courage exhibited by the lone Chinese refusing to yield his city to a column of tanks at Tiananmen Square. For a brief moment, he was a giant and the tanks were the ants because he held the higher moral ground. And when one has the higher moral ground, no power on earth can move him. Gandhi, Mandela, Martin Luther King, and many others have proven that point time and again as they took on immovable objects and turned them into ashes. If that kind of sacrifice is not what we are willing to give and hard work, then things will not change anytime soon. I'm not sure how much time I have.
Take a couple more minutes if you want to.
All right. Let me address a little bit of the U.S. role. The fact that in the past, Washington sponsored and managed to pass a resolution at the UN to lift the arms embargo in Somalia was a clear indication of its inclination of facilitating arms shipment and foreign troops movement into the country for what turned out to be the Ethiopian invasion at the time. Having supported the losing side previously when it backed the infamous warlords, the U.S. was keen on making an impression on the ground, and this time supported the TFG. The hope was that by achieving some military victories on the battlefield with Ethiopian troops, they might weaken the Islamic movement, or at least bring it down to a manageable level. It turned out to be a misguided policy, having achieved to radicalize even further an already radical group. This reflexive approach that favors dealing with the symptoms instead of the underlying conditions is precisely the reason why the U.S. seems to be losing credibility among the Somali population and running out of good options on the ground. Before we address the U.S. shortcomings, it's worth noting that the Somali conflict has been in the past a Somali affair. Sure, there were always outside forces looking after their own interests, wanting to shape events, venues, and even outcomes, but none of them previous concocted government were able to take root because they all lacked legitimacy in the eyes of the people, and time after time, different pretenders and their supporters came and left when they could not achieve the necessary traction to last. Things are somewhat different this time. The roles have been reversed, and the strings are being pulled by outside forces and interests looking for the right proving grounds, and the Somalis are the willing puppets in this latest mad dash to these familiar trails that we have come to know so well. And the trouble with Islamists is that other than claiming that God is on their side, that they are the only ones who are qualified to implement his laws, they have proven to be a bit too opaque for anyone to know the real reasons and their intentions, whether they are actually an outgrowth of local discontent with the decade-long warlords, feuds, Ethiopian invasions, or whether they are a Wahhabi nurtured environment, movement, whose interests and priorities may not be necessarily those of the Somali people. The imposition of Sharia law, banning trivial matters such as soccer matches, movies, music, and smoking, among other things, when the country is on the verge of a new war, does not inspire confidence in the decision-making process of those who claim to be rightly guided. It's also worth noting that if there's a lot of history to suggest that there is an inordinate amount of foreign interference in Somalia, especially Ethiopia, whose interests are distinctly different and usually opposite from what can be considered genuine Somali interests. Wars are by nature an extension of political endgames, and the question that begs an answer is whose political endgame this war is going to serve? The Wahhabis, the United States, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Egypt, Yemen, they're all players, the European Union. Too many cooks in this version of Hell's Kitchen. But what's abundantly clear is that the chef with the fewest resources will be the one holding the short end of this political stick. This means the one with the least amount of political, economic, and military power is the one likely to suffer the lasting consequences of this war. And when the guns and bombs fall silent, the burning issue for Somalis is not going to be about finding the elusive right tribal balance to shape the next government, but how much worse will things get? The other possible scenario is of course living under a radicalized version of the infallible rule of God, administered by very fallible, sword-yielding individuals. No good outcome for any Somali is likely to come out of this unless the conversation and disagreement remains among and between Somalis. And even though this particular debate has been going on far too long, the fact remains that we have the right tools to resolve our differences. What we lack is the right leadership. Whatever one feels about Somaliland, there is no ignoring the fact that they seem to have found a workable solution to their differences that does not involve shooting someone into submission. Elections are routine, and losers actually concede and walk away from their official aspirations after coming just 80 votes short of being elected to the highest office in the land. The first presidential Somaliland presidential election, the opposition party lost by 80 votes. 80. And they walked away from that. The secret to their success is rooted in the belief that war is no longer an option to settle political differences, and that there is wisdom and respect in the rule of elders. This brought about the unusual spectacle of aspiring office seekers who are no longer able to shoot their way into top positions and are instead reduced to beg for votes while making promises they cannot keep like any other politician. This seemingly unattainable condition for Somalis in the South is very much within their reach. What is required for them is to recognize that true reconciliation and peace can only be found if they stop seeking the right formula for peace in foreign capitals and instead look inward and follow the proven path their brothers in the Somaliland have taken. Somaliland can play a major role in facilitating such an endeavor by offering to mediate between the two factions in the South and inviting them to Hargeisa to provide the right venue and conditions to allow such peace conferences to take place. This new initiative will have a greater chance of success if the United States, who is currently seen as myopic and part of the larger problem, change its stand and supports a negotiated solution for the current situation before the unintended consequences of a shooting war becomes hardened reality on the ground. With the right combination of carrots and sticks, the TFG and the opposing radical groups can be induced to come to Hargeisa and negotiate in good faith as brothers among brothers. A new approach from Washington will go a long way in changing the negative perception of being seen as one-dimensional, reactive entity to one that's supportive and respectful of the wishes of the aspirations of Somali people. Soft power is what's needed here. There are real advantages for Somaliland to take a more prominent role in this matter as well, because it's in its best interest to play the peacemaker role today and create goodwill and trust among its very volatile neighbors, instead of waiting and dealing with the aftermath creation of whatever radicalized entity is to emerge from the current chaotic environment. Sticking your head in the sand and hope for the best is no longer an option for Somaliland. It's time to be proactive and shape events while the window of opportunity still exists, and gain the stature and recognition so far that have eluded. The elephant in the room when Somaliland is in the mix is always is one that we're all aware of, recognition. But addressing the sovereignty issue at this juncture is quite premature and should be postponed to a more suitable period when there is an actual legitimate entity in the South that can give its due consideration instead of an absolute prevailing positions that are currently taken. This may be hearsay in some camps, but the quickest way for a stable Mogadishu may actually go through Hargeisa, not Nairobi, not Djibouti, and definitely not Addis Ababa. In conclusion, what I suggest we do is for Somalis, for every tribe, to sit under the cool shade of a thorn tree. It has yet to fail the elders, and I think that's probably the only way they're going to get their peace. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am pleased to be here tonight, but also quite humbled by it because, unlike the previous speaker and the ones who follow me, I'm not a Somali expert. I'm not an ethnic area studies person. I've never been to Mogadishu or to Puntland. I don't know nearly enough about Somali political history or tribes and their way of life. I don't know nearly enough about Islam or Islam in Somalia, and or about the history and development of the conflict of religion and politics there. So as Hussein and I were talking about this event, I repeatedly asked him, "Are you sure you want me?" And he kept saying yes. So I have to trust his wisdom on that, and you're stuck with his judgment. But I am instead an American who's done a fair amount of thinking about the conflict between religion and politics in general, but also particularly with a focus on the United States. And I guess I'm hopeful that what I have to say about that will be useful in some way to interpreting or explaining what's going on with militant Islam and the clash and conflict around religion and politics in Somalia today. But to do that, I want to make two sets of distinctions first. Partly it'll help clarify where I'm coming from. The first has to do with what we're doing in any active interpretation, and the second has to do with the way I interpret the key issues in religion and politics. So there are three things, of course, that come into play in any interpretation, regardless of what we're doing. The first thing is what it is we're trying to understand, data, the situation. Very totally not an expert in the case of Somalia. The second thing is, apart from the data, we all have minds and we use them. So that's what we listen, we ask questions, we get insights, we react, we reflect, we change our minds, we have opinions, we try to engage. We use all of those cognitive and mental and inner conscious operations to do that, to interpret the what it is. And tonight it's the issue of today in Somalia, particularly the religious and political conflict. But the third aspect, and this is the one I'm most focused on, is the interpretive framework that we use to pattern our minds as we think about it. So as you can see, I'm more of a philosopher than I am a commentator, and my focus is therefore on the third, on the kind of framework that we bring to thinking about the problem of religion and conflict. In other words, it's sort of religious imagination that we're operating with when we think about that relationship. So I want to be talking about that, not so much the data of Somalia, and you'll have to make those connections. You'll be using your minds to do that, and probably to a big way of discussion. We can see how this works out. But so that's one set of distinctions: the what, our minds, and the interpretive framework. The second set of distinctions is three issues, really, that get played out in various ways in various historical contexts on the issue of religion and politics. And the way that I see them, and I'll be talking about them in terms of the American context and reflecting a little bit on how it might apply to Somalia, is on the one hand, there's a sacralization to be overcome. There's a secularization to be welcomed. And there's a secularization to be resisted, a sacralization to be overcome, a secularization to be resisted, and a spiritualization to be welcomed and developed. I'll talk about those three things, focusing mostly on the first one. And in terms of the sacralization to be overcome, I'll illustrate from U.S. history to give you a sense of what I mean. And you're not picking them up. Okay. Part of American lore, and be patient while I'm talking about wraparound and Somalia. Part of American lore is that the original settlers from Europe came over here fleeing religious persecution in search of religious freedom. And that's of course true. But it's also true that what they meant by religious freedom was the opportunity to set up colonies and situations where they could impose their own religious laws and rules. So that in the first, as many of you know, the first 13 colonies in the U.S., 9 had established churches. All 13 of them required religious oaths if you were going to be in the military or hold political office. And in Virginia, there were lots of religious laws, and they were particularly tough on Quakers, as some of you may know. If a Quaker came over the border from Pennsylvania into Virginia, on first offense, they would simply be exiled and sent back. On second offense, of just being here, they would be jailed. And if they did it a third time, for whatever reason, they would be executed. So there are laws of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in which if you refuse to confess that the God of the Old and New Testaments is the true God, you could be killed. And if you cursed God or you took the name of the Lord in vain, you could be locked up and named. So there are lots of religiously oriented laws in the history of the United States, and the issue is pretty clearly expressed by James Madison in 1774, 2 years before the Declaration of Independence, and he wrote a letter to William Bradford, who's talking about Virginia, where he says, "This vexes me worst of anything whatever. There are at this time in the adjacent country not less than 5 or 6 well-meaning men in jail for publishing their religious sentiments, which in the main are very orthodox. I have neither patience to hear, talk, or think of anything relative to this matter, for I have squabbled and scolded, abused and ridiculed so long about it, to so little purpose, that I am without common patience. So I must beg you to pity me and to pray for liberty of conscience for all." Madison is dismayed by the way his compatriots, almost all of them apparently, spontaneously turned to the power of the state to enforce religious loyalty and obedience. It was the common sense of the time. And no matter how much he squabbled and scolded, abused and ridiculed, and said, people have consciences. Don't you recognize that? The answer was, no, we don't. And what I'm interested in is why that might be the case, and what's going on there. Because if so, in other words, I'm interested in the religious imagination, or the interpretive framework that people in colonial America, and apparently to some degree in Somalia these days, and everywhere, when they see something that's contrary to their religious tradition, it seems both necessary and reasonable to use force to correct it. What Madison is saying is that people who are doing that are missing something. That is, that you can't, that there's a key distinction to be made between religious belief and human conscience. But it isn't. But it's a distinction that most of his compatriots at the time could not see, and so I guess my question is, and the thing that I'll ask us to reflect on for a second, is what's going on when people do that? It's very hard for people in America because of our culture, because of the to think that way. But I want to suggest that people who are thinking that way have a religious imagination that doesn't, in which they don't necessarily have religious beliefs, but they are their religious beliefs. And I want to draw a quick example. Many of you know this one. I know at least one of you does. From Piaget, who was the Swiss psychologist who did a lot of work on cognitive development. And he started with infants and worked his way up. And he makes he had this classic experiment in which he set 3 glasses on a table for young children. And 2 of them had water in it, and 1 of them didn't. And 2 of them were tall, the same size, like this. Imagine them being clear. And the other one was wider. And these 2 were filled with water. And so a child was there, and he had said, are these 2 glasses full? And the child would say, yes, they are. And then he would take one of them, and he'd pour it in the lower glass, and he would say, so are they equal now? And the child would say, no, they're not equal now. And then he would take this and pour it back in the other one, and say, well, are they equal? And he would say, yep, now they are. And he'd report back and forth and back, and they would say, yes, they're equal, no, they're not. Yes, they're equal, no, they're not. And the child was unable to make a distinction between their, I'm sure Piaget talked about this better than I am, but their, what they saw and what they understood. Everything they saw was what they didn't have their perceptions intellectually, they were them. And I just want to make a parallel between that and the notion that when people are their religious beliefs, rather than having their religious beliefs, it makes perfect sense when you see, because then what you are is what you do, and your religious behavior is who you are. So if someone is saying something or doing something contrary to religious belief, you change them, and you don't have the variable in there of conscience. I guess I'm suggesting that isn't an easy move to make. That it isn't just an intellectual one. That what Madison and Jefferson and the early called the founders did was argue over and over and over and over again for people to pay attention inward, to pay attention to themselves, and to notice that with regard to their religious beliefs, they had conscience. And when the penny dropped on that one, then people said, oh my goodness. If you have a conscience and you have religious beliefs instead of our being your religious beliefs, then it makes no sense to coerce them, because you just make hypocrites out of people. You make a fool out of yourself. Now, once you have that insight, it's really, really difficult to imagine your way back. And you just think the person who doesn't have that insight is crude or using religion or not really religious or something. And well, once that penny dropped in the U.S., then we have Article 6. Section 6, Article 3 of the Constitution, banning religious oaths, and the First Amendment to the Constitution saying we wouldn't have an established church, and we have to preserve religious freedom of religious expression. So the common sense in the U.S. shifted. The point here is that the great gift, I mean, in the U.S. of Madison and Jefferson and so forth, was that they helped American culture to distinguish religion and politics, conscience and belief in a political way that got institutionalized and then became acculturated to people. And now I'll move quickly to the rest because I think we're running out of time. But what they didn't do, was they distinguished them, but they didn't connect them. And so what happened over the next couple hundred years was that people began to think of these two, and particularly in the last 50 years with all the Supreme Court decisions we've had, think of them as a separation of church and state rather than a distinction between it. And so when you then have colonial powers or the U.S. government going to Somalia or to other places and saying, well, here's how you ought to handle religion and politics, there's a tendency to impose a separation of the two, because we have adequately differentiated conscience and religious belief. But in the U.S., there's been a strong culture war growing over the last 80 years here, which has resisted that, and that's the secularization to be resisted. And I think that's the same thing that's happening around the world. I think it's certainly happening in Somalia, because there's another distinction that needs to be made. Not only with religious belief do we need to distinguish conscience, data, but there's an implicit assumption that being religious is having beliefs. And if you identify your religion with your beliefs, that's so you define whether you're religious or not in terms of whether you have them or not. But actually, there's another interior movement that many of us, that we all have, I would argue, and that many of us distinguish, which is the spiritual experience openness to the transcendence that attaches us to those beliefs in the first place. And if you don't, just as with conscience, if you don't pay attention to that, if you're moved by God, if you're moved by the Spirit to be religious, but you don't distinguish the movement of the Spirit and the beliefs that you're attached to, and you don't distinguish conscience, you get a very, very zealous, but very devout religious person. I think in the U.S., probably because of the Christian background and the scriptural text that where Jesus says, render unto Caesar things that are Caesar's and unto God things that are God's, it was easier to take the route, and because of the European Enlightenment, it was easier to take the route of distinguishing conscience from religion first. Now we face the struggle of being a largely secular culture, and we have to figure out how to spiritualize politics without politicizing religion if we're going to overcome the culture war. I think it's probably different in Somalia, in which you have, as I understand it, I don't know for sure, but in Islam and in the history of Islam, the emergence of Sufism within the tradition is the cultivation of the distinction between tradition and spirit, or spiritual awareness and the tradition, and to the degree that religious law, Sharia, becomes interpreted that way, I think it's probably the path to move toward the recovery of conscience. And so I think I'm out of time. And so that's it.
Okay, thank you, Jimmy. Terrance, why don't you pick up?
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming, and thank you, Hussein, for organizing us here today. I'm slightly, maybe I have a slightly different worries than Jamie about why I'm on this panel. I have studied politics and conflicts in the Horn of Africa for quite some time, but I don't regard myself as a Somali specialist. There were many in the room, some on the panel with me, who know Somalia far better than I, and so I'm going to not assert or not present myself as somebody who has that level of understanding. The other thing that makes me, as I sort of try to orient myself to the remarks that I want to make, is there's two things that are going on. On the one hand, I have some points that I want to make that are somewhat abstract, the kind of point you might expect a professor to make or somebody who looks at U.S. foreign policy to make. But at the same time, I've been worrying today about friends and colleagues who are in Mogadishu today, where the violence is horrific. Right now, the violence is just horrific in Mogadishu. And there are people, colleagues of ours at ICAR and other friends, who are very much worried about friends and loved ones in Mogadishu. So there's an immediacy and a heartfelt response to these questions, yet I'm going to take my role of being somewhat abstract from them. So if you want, maybe you'll see that tension, or maybe it can be developed further during question and answer. The first thing I wanted to kind of tease out, though, was the basic question of what's new. What's new in Somalia? Why are we talking about Shabaab now? Why are we talking about Sharia, political Islam now in Somalia? On the one hand, Somali culture has not in the past been a very rich terrain for these types of Islamic movements. The Somali culture has always been Islamic, no question about that, but there have been cross-cutting other forms of solidarities and social organizations on the basis of kinship, clan, and different types of customary law that emphasized payments for crime. So in other words, if one group did something wrong to another, there was an exchange of camels and other things. Not the amputations, but a very different tradition of how wrongs are addressed. Some of my colleagues or some of you who are Somalis reflect deeper on that. But Somali culture, there's, as always, continuity in culture. And so there hasn't been a dramatic shift in Somali culture in the last 10 years or 5 or 6 years, yet we do see a rise in the importance of certain militarized groups like Al-Shabaab and certain ideas like imposing Sharia law and mobilizing people on the basis of Islam. I give you three baskets, really, of reasons as to why I think that might be what might be happening, what's new in Somalia at this moment. The first is that the rise of political Islam in Somalia follows the introduction of U.S.-based, U.S. policies in the global war of terrorism imposed on the Horn of Africa, distorted or allowed certain groups within Somalia to position themselves as the defenders of Islam and thereby challenge the United States. And so the internationalization of conflicts in Somalia in the aftermath of 9/11 provided a ready opportunity for Islamist groups. Related to that, but not precisely the same because they had different agendas, was the Ethiopian intervention of December 2006, where Ethiopia intervened and overthrew the Union of Islamic Courts regime and put in place the transitional federal government. And so in resistance to this Ethiopian occupation and the fervent nationalist, anti-Ethiopian attitudes, or attitudes in opposition to the traditional rival, the rival going back, through centuries, with an overlay of U.S. intervention in the global war on terrorism, allowed political leaders in Somalia to merge Somali nationalism with Islam and to position themselves as both Somali nationalists and the strongest defenders of Islam by attacking America that was seen as working hand in glove with Ethiopia with a Christian agenda to diminish the role of Islam around the world. So that moment became linked to the violence in southern Lebanon or in Iraq or Afghanistan or in Palestine and so forth, into a larger narrative, if you will, or a larger sense as to what the conflict in Somalia was about, that many Somalis, very unhappy that the United States was bombing the cities in Somalia, very unhappy that there were Ethiopians patrolling their capital, gravitated towards. Second cluster of issues relates to why is the Shabaab important now, is to understand that while there is this locally driven set of conflicts within Somalia, there's also a regional overlay. I've already mentioned Ethiopia. But another part of that is Ethiopia and its neighbor Eritrea have had a horrible, violent border war in 1998 to 2000 that is now, the peace process is now, best you can say, stalled. It's off the rails. It's frozen. The Eritreans are extremely frustrated. And one of the ways they've responded is by providing assistance to Ethiopia's enemies, including Islamists in Somalia. So that's another potential answer. Why the Shabaab now? Well, because the Shabaab is receiving assistance from a regional ally, and in that way, that's why this rather small, kind of historically anomalous group is able to play such an important role in Mogadishu today. And the third cluster of ideas has to do with the nature of the transitional federal government in Somalia. There was a reconstitution, a new set of actors who formed the transitional federal government earlier this year. But again, I'll let we can get into questions and answers. An enormously complicated story. The main point that I want to make now is the transitional federal government in Mogadishu is extraordinarily weak. It doesn't control significant armed forces and is therefore vulnerable. And so what allows the Shabaab and militant Islam to play a particularly prominent role in Mogadishu today is that there is a vacuum. As the TFG is weak, and therefore these other groups are stronger in relative terms and appear to be able to play such a significant role. getting even more kind of narrower in some of my questions, but a question that's very much on the minds of people here in Washington, and so I wanted to raise it in response really to the second issue that Wallace raised in his introduction, not only the question of religion, but the question of what role should the U.S. play. And that's this question of, is Shabaab the same as Al-Qaeda? Is Shabaab and Al-Qaeda a global terrorist organization? And there seems to be links among some, I would venture to say, are a relatively small number of fighters in Somalia today. Obviously, these things are hard to judge, and I don't have access to any classified information, so I'm just trying to tease it out from what is available. And let me use one historical analogy to, I think, illustrate what how I understand Al-Qaeda trying to operate in Somalia. There is, in the period from 1992 to 1994, there's a set of documents that were captured by the U.S. government about Al-Qaeda trying to mobilize in Somalia at that time. You can see them on, there's a website. It's called the Harmony Project, and they've been translated and annotated by the U.S. government. And those documents are actually fascinating in the way that they reflect the difficulties Al-Qaeda had in organizing in Somalia. They were trying to create networks in Somalia, and their complaints back, their agents in Somalia were complaining back to their leadership what a frustrating experience it was, because those Somalis are so fractious, those Somalis are so difficult to organize, that they seem to care about clan more than they do about Islam, or they're not following the type of Islam that Al-Qaeda asserted was the type of Islam that was most appropriate for Somalia and other parts of the Islamic world. And so there's a built-in tension between global Islamic projects, initiatives, and the rich cultural, historical material in Somalia. There's a mismatch there that I think favors the Somali, more deeply rooted Somali political dynamics rather than the more recent developments. And inevitably, any political movement in Somalia will remain deeply embedded within Somali cultural and political dynamics I was just alluding to. Also in the Horn of Africa, certain political dynamics that haven't gone away, just to maybe make that a bit more explicit. If, for example, Al-Shabaab that's fighting in Mogadishu today were to successfully consolidate its hold on Mogadishu, I would certainly anticipate a reaction from Ethiopia. Ethiopia has done this before. They smashed Al-Ittihad in the early 90s. They smashed the Islamic courts in 2006. And again, those deeply rooted historical dynamics about how the Ethiopian state and particular government today regards Somalia in any effort to bring a militant Islamic government in Mogadishu will have to overcome. Maybe to close then with some broader points about that. What I think is most dangerous, in a sense, for the Somali people, for the prospects for peace and stability in Somalia, is when locally based processes, the struggles within Somalia, the struggles across the Horn of Africa, become either regionalized or internationalized. Provides fuels to the conflict and can lead them to escalate quite readily, as we saw during the period of the Islamic courts and the transitional federal government under Yusuf, with Ethiopian intervention. The Ethiopian troops were still in Mogadishu. And to the extent that the dynamics are allowed to be Somali dynamics and allow the rich countervailing forces that are in Somalia, and the different traditions, and the clan and kinship networks, in traditional law, the role of the elders, as was mentioned, the kinds of processes that we see with relative success in Somaliland, then the threat of a non-indigenous ideological movement is much less. So if political transitions in Somali are kept Somaliized or kept within the context of the Somali state, then I think there's far less to worry about in terms of the future prospects of militant Islam in Somalia.
Thank you, Terrance. You have closing remarks?
Thank you very much for coming. I will focus on two things. One is what is the nature and the root causes of this militant Islam in Somalia, and the second theme is the law that was passed recently, the Islamic law making a law that's very ambiguous. So I will focus on that a little bit on what does it really mean for Somalia. The roots of this Islamic movement are complex. Of course, it's very hard to understand because not much is written about it. Today I will focus on Al-Shabaab and I will focus on Al-Ittihad. And Al-Ittihad is really the one that you need to know if you have to understand militant Islam in Somalia, because she is the mother. I focus on these two groups because they have similar views and they have similar interests. The ideology is to really transform Somalia into an Islamic state of their version. Where, for example, in Kismayo, last week, Muhammad Umar Ismail's right hand was cut off for stealing some fishnets that were worth about $90. Al-Shabaab, is important to understand, seeks power, and force is the means in which they gain. Today you see the war that's raging in Mogadishu, where you have the Transitional Federal Government that was formed in January trying to struggle, and you have about almost 100 people that have died just in the last few days. A word of caution, however, not every political movement that is Islam is a fundamentalist or terrorist. There are a lot of examples like Al-Islah, which actually the name means reconciliation or mediation, that advocate for indigenous sense and a culture which is really very compatible to Somalia and how we remember as people. They're interested in power, but they are very non-violent. Al-Ittihad, this is a group that emerged in 1991 after the fall of the Somali government, Siad Barre's government. And it first emerged in Kismayo and in Gado region, and the group really was composed of different Somali tribes, and probably this is their strength. Even elements of Al-Shabaab, you have almost every group within it. Of course, we don't know the counting, so but generally. The wars of the 1990s, for example, was very problematic for Al-Ittihad because they were uneasy with the tribal wars. Their agenda was a little bit much more higher. They wanted an Islamic republic of their own, and they saw these the wars of the tribes as very nasty and almost very un-Islamic. So they had very difficulty. Of course, they did participate in the war in the areas that they lived, for example, in Gado region of Kismayo, when the different tribes were, in order to protect their turf. During this time, they focused on their attention on building a grassroots movement. And they were very good at breaking deals with whoever that was governing in a particular city. For example, in Kismayo, in the early 1990s, they basically controlled the port, and this allowed for them to collect a lot of money and support also from some Islamic charitable organizations. And then with that money they were really able to buy a massive amount of weapons, and in a few months you had Kismayo. Al-Ittihad was probably one of the most powerful political organizations in the region. In 1992, the group moved in Gado region. Actually, I was there at the time, and they controlled the city of Lop, which is one of the most strategic cities of Gado region. In this city, this is probably the place they tried for the first time. They imposed very harsh rules, not like the kind that we see where no hands were cut off, but cigarettes were banned, music was a problem, and qat, you couldn't even get qat. Well, I don't know, most people know qat. It's very special for Somalis. The 1990s also were very tough for Somalia. Most Somalis were really tired of the tribal wars. But Ittihad, it portrayed itself as a tribal Muslim organization that wanted to restore peace and order in Somalia. And in this, they were able to attract many young people who were fighting in the wars, and they gave up and joined them. They were so successful that they were even invited to come to Puntland region, where then, even that place, they were able to control the city, to control and collect the taxes. It's amazing. They even collect taxes sometimes. But then they imposed a very harsh rule where women were really asked to cover. Music was also a problem. And this made a lot of people, the local people, very uncomfortable. And finally, a war started to break out between Al-Ittihad and the secular Somali Salvation Democratic movement, which was at the time led by Yusuf, who was the former president of the TFG. The war left hundreds of people who died. At some points, you had a son and his father fighting from both, one fighting for the SSDF, the other fighting for Al-Ittihad. It was very fractious. It really destroyed the community because father and son were unable to relate to each other anymore. That was the ideology. It was very problematic. Finally, after the Al-Ittihad were driven out, of course they were defeated by the SSDF. They were driven out of Puntland region, and they finally, the group arrived in Mogadishu in the early 90s. And here it was able to organize and align itself with former other Islamist groups. Al-Ittihad became so powerful that it was able to help the different court systems because they had amazing organizational skills that they have tried in Kismayo and Gado and Puntland. Of course, we can go through the history, but I want to be, I have only like a few more minutes. Finally, in 2006, the group was so powerful that they were able to defeat the warlords, who were supported briefly by the US government that saw the warlords, that saw this Islamist movement as a threat to their own security. Now, the potential merger or not of Al-Ittihad, the Union of Islamic Courts, and Al-Shabaab is very murky and problematic. No one knows. But at the moment, Al-Shabaab happens to be one of the most powerful of Islamic groups in Somalia. Like Al-Ittihad, it's also on the list of US terrorists. Now, Al-Shabaab, its ideology is really alien and harsh, and many Somalis feel uncomfortable with our version of war. Good questions you can ask, how come so many people are following them? We probably can talk about this in the session. Now, the question of who funds this group, I haven't really seen any receipts. Obviously, they do receive some funding from somewhere, and God knows, so I will not try to say they're being supported from particular region or particular, because I don't know. And I want to be clear about that. On the question of the future prospect of Al-Shabaab, or any other similar movement that may come after them, I feel if the Western world does not engage positively in Somalia by supporting the current Somali government and really try to save it, and the regions where this ideology was rejected, then Al-Shabaab will prevail in Somalia and form an Islamic Republic of Al-Shabaab's form and kind. I believe if this happens, it will be very problem for the region and the freedoms of the Somali people, and the security of the region will be in question. Now, I would like to talk about a little bit about the Islamic law that was passed by the government. On April 18, the Somali Parliament, as I said earlier, adopted Sharia law as the law of the land. Now, the real question for me and for many Somalis is not that the adoption of Islamic law alone, but how, as we talk, how it's interpreted and implemented, and what does it mean for other regions of Somalia. Of course, this move was initiated by the Somali Transitional Federal Government on March 10th, and the goal for many Somalis now understand is to really appease an umbrella of Islamic groups, many of them, and to make sure that they come into the government. It's very unfortunate that Al-Shabaab does not want to talk to the government. Now, a few weeks ago, Sheikh Sharif Ahmed, the president of Somalia, said Islamic law is something that everyone in Somalia believes in and lives by. I really think the president is right here, because if you look at the history of Somalia since the advent of Islam in the 7th century, you can see that Somalia has a long history of Islamic law adhering to tolerant religious traditions, as Terrance was saying earlier. Now, many Somalis are Sunni, and we follow many Sufi orders of different, such as Qadiriya, and the oldest Sufi order in Islam, and Ahmadiyya, that we see found in the 18th century. Now, our tradition of Islam that we know was, I say was, because we no longer really can recognize what's happening in Somalia, was less concerned about regulating people's behavior rather than worshipping God and celebrating the beauty of nature. Now, the Somali government from the time of independence in 1960 to the last central government in Somalia, before the war broke out, adopted a mix of Islamic law and Western system of government that worked for us, and I feel that was compatible to Somali's sense of moderation and faith. I would say while Sheikh Sharif Ahmed is wise to engage and seek peaceful ways to reduce the violence in the country, I feel he really has to be very careful not to present his political compromise as concession to this ideology. Moreover, the Somali federal government has a charter which allows most regions in Somalia to govern their own affairs. Some questions are now being raised. Does this government actually, does it follow the old charter? Does it allow regions to govern their own affairs? I think Sheikh Sharif Ahmed is probably in the right place and probably at the right time and the right person at this moment because of his relationship with Union Islamic Courts to initiate such a dialogue, to reach out to all Somalis, the traditional elders, the diaspora, the people who live in the country, and to expand and to be very open with his talks with the Al-Shabaab and other Islamist groups, so the Somalis are able to decide what is going on. I think Somalia suffered continuously over 18 years. 500,000 people have died, 320,000 are displaced within the country, and 1 million refugees, including me, are outside of the country. I think we deserve to have a say in how the laws that govern them, govern Somalis, will be formed, and what Sharia law means for us is something that the Somalis need to know. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hussein. Thank you for the